This is Jizio Manga. Welcome to the studio. So tonight we have a little bit of a Magic Mike situation going on here. We are going to practice how to draw the male form in different stylish poses. First things first, let's establish the three basic shapes that are going to create the skeleton for these figures. I'm using an approximation of what the actual human anatomy would be. So the actual human anatomy would be a skull, the rib cage, and the pelvis. Instead of going into very detailed drawings of the anatomy figures, I want to emphasize to you, the viewer, you should simplify the process by using these basic shapes. And there are different ways to draw the torso. As you see here in figure 2, I am emphasizing the direction of the spine downwards first. I am adding in the pelvis. And finally, I'm going to add in the shape of the torso. Now for the torso and the pelvis, I'm emphasizing that these are 3D figures for you to follow, because our bodies aren't flat, and for them to be able to move, they need to have different dimensions. When it comes to drawing the male body specifically, as you can see here in figure 3, I want to emphasize the broad shoulders, almost nacho-shaped back or torso. So it is wider at the top and more angular towards the bottom and the pelvis, almost like a triangle figure, as opposed to the hourglass figures that the previous female poses had in my latest video. So here we go again with figure 4. Circle for the head, direction of the spine is downwards, facing us, the audience. I am using a block shape for the rib cage, emphasizing that this is a 3D object. Same thing for the pelvis. At this point, I'm going to erase the spine just so I can emphasize and highlight the 3 distinct shapes that make up the torso. So I want to demonstrate the rib cage being separate from the spine. Now moving on to figure number 5, as shown here using a different color. The direction of the face is demonstrated using the cross that I've drawn on the circle. Now the neck follows the spine heading downwards. Once again, we are emphasizing in the male figure the broad shoulders going downwards to a narrow pelvis. And I'm adding shading to re-emphasize that the ribcage and the pelvis should be thought of as 3D shapes. Now that we've established the 3 central shapes that make up our skeleton, it's time to complete it by adding joints, which create the limbs by extension. I'm going to start with the shoulders, then the hips. These circular points represent anything that bends. So you can bend your shoulders, you can bend your elbows, you can bend your hips and your knees. That is how our figure is going to be moved into different poses. See here, I'm connecting the limbs to each of the joints that move. And from the torso, connecting down to the pelvis, I'm drawing lines to demonstrate the figure attaching itself. So just the outline of the actual male figure attaching itself. I'm going to repeat the same process of adding shoulders, elbows, continuing the limbs, connecting the rib cage to the pelvis, just to fully flesh out this moving and workable skeleton. For figure number 4, I'm going to repeat the exact same process, shoulder to shoulder, but I'm going to connect both of them using a V line, and this is going to represent our collarbone. I also want to point out the different size hands in this figure. And if you see my previous video, this represents perspective. The larger something is, the closer it appears, and the smaller something is, the farther away it appears. So this pose is using a little bit of perspective. Now the principle of perspective can be tricky when applying it to body parts, because you have to take into consideration the dimension and muscles and how large they're going to look depending on the distance of the muscles from the audience. For the remainder of this section, I'm going to complete the skeletons for poses 3 and 5. Completing the hands, shape of the feet, basic triangles, keep it simple, stupid. The more simplified your body parts, the better understanding of its physical shape and form. So I would just practice using these figures as much as possible and practice simplifying body parts into basic shapes. Alrighty, with that, we have completed our skeletons. Let's add some meat on these bones. I'd say this section is the most challenging, only because there are so many muscle groups that belong in the human body. Anatomically speaking, what I'm drawing on the screen isn't correct. It's again the approximation of what I believe to be the most prominent muscle groups in the male form, especially the ones that are exaggerated in mediums like manga and anime. So we typically have a broad, big chest, very beefy, followed by broad shoulders, large biceps, large forearms, again following this idea of a large top, narrow body, so the nacho shape, broad top narrowing downwards. I'm trying to also articulate the muscle groups in the legs, so separating the thighs or the quads from the knees and the shins, and separating the feet. Finally, I'm going to finish this pose off by separating the pecs. With that done, I can continue practicing and focusing on the same muscle groups with the other figures. So I'm always going to highlight the chest muscles more prominently, and then I'm going to follow through with the arms. Similarly to the legs, I'm going to separate the arms into their sections and muscle groups. So I'm separating the forearms from the upper arms, like the shoulders, triceps, and biceps. I'd like to reiterate or just repeat myself that this is not anatomically correct. These are just the main groups that we see in cartoons, so I like to practice emphasizing them and exaggerating them to a point. So I'm going to exaggerate these pecs, separate them out, finish up with the lats and the abs, which is typically drawn as a line coming down the center of the torso. If you're unfamiliar with the majority of these muscle groups, which is how most of us artists start out, you can just copy the figures that you see here on the screen. Practice the separation that I have established in this video. And of course, nothing helps more than using anatomical references that you can look up via the internet. Last but not least, I want to emphasize practicing with this cylinder that I've drawn at the top here with this shading, that muscles are 3D objects on their own. They flex. You can bend them, break them. Muscles tend to flex. So by practicing these cylinders, I am drawing lines to show the direction and width of the 3D shape. So depending on what pose your figure is taking, your muscles are going to bend a certain direction. And this is me putting that into practice on the arms and the legs to show what direction the muscles are flexing. Having separated these muscle groups and determined what directions they're facing, I've essentially completed all of these poses. Now I like to take the time to color code each section and each muscle group, just to facilitate you as an audience practicing these for yourselves.